Thank you very much, Michele, and thanks also to thanks also to Chris for inviting me for these 2 weeks. Before starting the presentation, I just would like to introduce myself. I come from the Trento University. It's a small university in the north part of Italy, and my research group is called Giant. It's formed by 4 professors: Marco Tubino, Guido Tolesi, Walter Bertoldi, and Marco Toffolon. I'm a postdoc there. And I'm studying river morphodynamics. So basically, I'm studying 3 aspects of river morphodynamics. I'm studying braided rivers, mainly in the laboratory. So we are trying to understand how the ridge scale properties of a braided river depends on condition. Then I'm studying alternate bars. This is an example of what we are working on with Mirko and Michele, are a pattern of alternate bars generated by, triggered by a grid or an array of hydrokinetic turbines. And third topic is about bifurcation, which is the topic I will speak about today. The channel bifurcation can be observed in a variety of fluvial environments: braided river, anastomosing river, deltas, alluvial fans. They are important because they govern the downstream distribution of water and sediment. And as a consequence, they can determine the flooding risk. They can determine the downstream availability of water resources. And more in general, they play a key role in the dynamics of an alluvial river. You can imagine a braided river like this. It can be, its dynamic can be sustained only via bifurcations. To start introducing the problem, I start with a motivating experiment. Here I report a case from the experiments of Bertoldi and Tubino in 2009, where they have a channel, bifurcating channel, where in the upstream branch, you have a spontaneous formation of alternate bars. Well, if in this case you define a discharge asymmetry as the scaled difference between the water in the 2 downstream branches, you observe a very different behavior of the system depending on the experimental conditions. In some cases, bifurcation keeps really nearly balanced. Sometimes one of the channels tend to carry more water. Sometimes you have a periodic switching of the dominant channel. And sometimes you can even have a complete closure of one of the branches due to the sedimentation at the entrance of the channel. So how can we explain this behavior? Is it possible to find some general rules about the response of the bifurcation depending on the channel conditions? Bifurcation morphodynamics has been widely studied in the last 30 years through different kinds of models, physical models, 2D, 3D numerical models, simplified reduced complexity models. This research clearly revealed a tendency of bifurcation to evolve towards unbalanced states. Like this is an example from a numerical simulation of Hardy et al., where water tends to flow towards the right branch. This is a very general tendency of bifurcation. This tendency may depend on 2 kinds of factors. It can depend on external factors, like upstream channel curvature, different slope of the downstream branches, backwater effects, different angles of the bifurcates. But it can also spontaneously arise as a free instability, as a result of a free instability mechanism. Well, my presentation is about these 2 kinds of factors. The first part of the presentation will be about the free instability, the spontaneous development of an asymmetric solution. The second part, I will try to analyze the effect of external forcing factors. Specifically, I will consider the effect of a curvature of the upstream channel, the effect of the different slope of the downstream branches, and the possible interaction between these two external factors. Well, in this first part, I can start again with experimental observation. It's a different set of laboratory experiments, again from Bertoldi and Tubino. They consider a mobile initially flat bed, fixed banks, and constant discharge. Moreover, this bifurcation has a symmetric geometry and symmetric boundary condition. This is why we call it a free bifurcation, in the sense that it is free of any ingredient that can advantage one of the two channels. What the authors found is a very different behavior depending on the beta, which is defined as the width to depth ratio of the main channel. When beta is relatively small, the solution is what you can expect. So you have small oscillations about a zero symmetry, which indicates a nearly balanced state of the system. However, when beta is relatively large, means the channel is relatively wide, the balanced state tends to be unstable. And the bifurcation naturally evolves towards a different equilibrium state, which is highly unbalanced, despite the symmetric geometry. This unbalanced partition of discharge is sustained by the formation of an upstream steady bar. This is evident from this numerical experiment. Here I report the equilibrium bed configuration, bed elevation map. And upstream the bifurcation, you have the formation of a steady deposition and scour. This steady bars has three consequences. First, you have a formation of an inlet step, which is a different elevation at the entrance of the channels. Then you have the topographic steering effect that tends to deviate water towards the right branch here. And then you have also an effect on the sediment load, which tends to get deviated by the gravity towards the right channel due to the transverse slope. Well, this is reasonable, but why does this upstream bar form? And why this is observed only when beta is relatively high? That's the main question. Well, to answer this question, we try to further simplify the problem. So I consider the simplest possible bifurcation. It is simply formed by a straight channel where I put a thin wall that divides the system. And I consider a two-dimensional shallow water and external equation. And I solve this equation through a linear perturbation approach. So here I don't have time to go in the analytical details. But if you are interested later, we can discuss about this. I just go directly to the results. The results indicate a close connection between the free instability and the morphodynamic influence. The theory of morphodynamic influence, which was originally developed by Zolesi and Seminara, 2001. According to this solution, you get two very different kind of behavior depending on beta being smaller or larger than the resonant value, which was originally defined by Blondeau and Seminara. This is related to the sign of the eigenvalues that define the spatial growth on damping on the solution, on the linear solution. And basically what happens is that in the so-called sub-resonant condition, so beta less than the resonant value, the two-dimensional morphodynamic information tends to travel downstream. And since in the upstream channel you have uniform flow, symmetric boundary condition, the system keeps symmetric, and the analytical solution is simply a flat bed solution, because it's the uniform flow that comes from upstream to downstream. On the other side, in super resonant condition, the main channel is able to propagate the information upstream. And in this case, the bifurcation takes control of the system and is able to form a spontaneous steady bar, just upstream here, that is responsible of the asymmetric solution we observed in the experiments. At least this is our interpretation that comes from this linear analysis of the shallow water equations. Well, this provides a criteria to define whether the bifurcation is balanced or is unbalanced. To test this criteria, here I report different cases about gravel bed bifurcations, which are illustrated in a plot where I have the shear stress on the x-axis and the difference between beta and the resonant beta on the y-axis, so that what's above the red line is super resonant, what is below is sub-resonant. As you can notice, the close markers that indicate bifurcation that are observed to be balanced tend to stay in the sub-resonant regime, while the empty markers indicating unbalanced bifurcation tend to stay above the red line. And the same occurs for sand bed bifurcations, so we have just a few cases that are observed to be stable. And so this criteria compare with previous criteria for bifurcation stability. I can't say it is better or it is worse. It's hard to answer this question. But I can say that it has an advantage because it doesn't not require the calibration of a specific parameter. Because the parameters comes from, are the classic parameter of the shallow water model. So no specific extra parameters are needed. Well, this is, okay, this is nice, this works. But, and here I move to the second part of the presentation. We cannot forget that natural bifurcation are not symmetric free as the one in the experiments, but are always, I would say, forced, but different factors, external factors, from upstream, like channel curvature, migrating alternate bars, or from downstream, different slopes, backwater effects, etc. What's the effect of something upstream or downstream? Here, like I report a solution for a curved upstream channel. In this case, more water tends to flow at the outer band, so the left channel is advantage. As a result, the bifurcation is, regardless the resonant threshold, tends to be unbalanced. In general, we can see that any asymmetric forcing can make the bifurcation unbalanced. This is pretty reasonable. But okay, at this point is the free instability mechanism we have observed with reference to the laboratory condition also important in those complex cases? Well, to answer this question, we formulate a very simple model based on the Bolla-Pitaluga scheme, where the 3 branches are modeled through a 1D scheme, and the 2-dimensional effects occurring at the bifurcation node are modeled by 2 cells of length that is alpha time the channel width, that exchange water and sediment according to a prescribed rule that is written here. Basically, the exchange of sediment is taken to be equal to the exchange of water plus a term that takes into account the gravitational effect on the bed load due to transverse slope, and an additional term that takes into account to the spiral flow, potential spiral flow inside the two cells. In this scheme, we added the upstream and the upstream effect due to channel curvature by simply providing different fluxes at the entrance of the two cells. So basically, depending on the radius of curvature, you can have more water and sediment on the outer band, so more fluxes entering the left cell. On the other side, the effect of different downstream slopes can be accounted by providing a different flow rating curves in the two channels, depending on this parameter called slope advantage. That is the scaled difference between the two slopes. Well, what's the result of this model? First, we consider the basic solution, which is with reference again to a symmetric free bifurcation. Well, for this case, we have for small values beta a balanced solution, but as far as beta becomes large, this solution becomes unstable, and the systems tend to evolve towards one state on the other side when one of the two channels tend to dominate. This is in qualitative agreement with what we have seen before regarding the resonant, the effect of the resonant threshold. To make this simplified model in agreement with what we have said before, so that we have to calibrate the model parameters, specifically the length of the cell, so that this point corresponds to the resonant beta. Because we know from previous theory that this has to be equal to the resonant value. Okay, so now we can start seeing the effect of the forcing by introducing a curvature of the channel. The curvature of the channel tends to break the symmetry of the system and tends to advantage, in this case, the left channel. If you increase the curvature, you obviously increase this effect. However, this effect is very different depending if you are in sub-resonant condition or if you are in super-resonant condition. Indeed, in sub-resonant condition, you have a strong effect of curvature. So you pass from nearly balanced bifurcation to highly unbalanced bifurcation. While in the super-resonant regime, the variations due to the curvature are pretty small because the system is still dominated by the free instability mechanism. The same mechanism that will occur without any curvature. In addition, you still have the possibility of opposite solution, where the water doesn't flow as you expect on the left, but the system can switch to the opposite state, where the channel branching at the inner band is actually dominating. Well, what happens if we also introduce a slope advantage? So let's start from a curved channel, so it's the solution we have just seen now. And we start to increase the slope of the right channel, which we expect will counterbalance the effect of the curve. What it happens, this effect can balance the effect of the curvature, and it can also dominate so that the right channel, if the slope is sufficiently high, tends to prevail. However, again, this behavior is highly different if you are in sub-resonant or in super-resonant case. To see this difference, you can just refer to two cases with fixed beta. One is sub-resonant and one is super-resonant. And we can try to see what's going on in these two cases. Well, in the sub-resonant case, I start with a curved channel, no slope advantage. The discharge asymmetry is positive, means that the left channel dominates. If I vary the slope advantage, I vary the discharge partition. Very smoothly, very as I would expect. In this way, we can find a point where the two effects compensate. And this is actually what has been done in the literature. For instance, in this paper of Martin Kleinans, they did numerical simulation to vary the slope until they found a point where the curvature is balanced. Okay, that makes very sense. But in resonant condition, that things highly changes in super resonant conditions, sorry. In this case, the solution is, okay, this one is unstable, so the two stable solutions are always highly unbalanced. And there are also multiple two stable states for the same range of parameters. In this case, if you imagine to vary the curvature to the slope advantage, you will never get a balanced solution, but you can have jumps between opposite solutions. And you can have also hysteresis of the response when you vary one of the forcing parameters. So very different behavior. This behavior in super resonant condition can be maybe better understood by considering a time-varying periodic forcing. So we consider a periodic oscillation of the slope advantage. You can imagine a sort of tide which influences just one of the two branches. And we select the period of this variation as proportional to the Exner time scale. Okay, this number 100 is not very important here because we are just looking at qualitative results. Well, in sub-resonant condition, what you have is something, again, expected. You have a limiting cycle where the bifurcation oscillates around a nearly balanced state. You have some hysteresis due to the fact that you need time for the bifurcation to adaptate to the varying condition. In super resonant condition, situation is different, and it depends actually on the intensity of the variation. If the forcing is relatively small, relatively weak, the limiting cycle after a transitory phase, they either stay on one branch or on the other branch of the solution. Which one? It depends, of course, on the initial condition. So the system can either evolve from one state and stay there, other state and oscillates there. Conversely, when the forcing, the amplitude of the oscillation is high enough, you can have switching behavior of the bifurcation that can periodically switch between a state where the left channel dominates and the opposite states when the other channel dominates. And okay. With this in mind, we can come back to our original motivating experiments, and we can try to understand what's going on in these different cases. Okay, in this case, the main channel, we had alternate bars that were migrating downstream. And in the sub-resonant condition, which was the first plot of their paper, they have these oscillations around the balance conditions. So we can interpret this oscillation as an effect of the migrating bars. So migrating bars move downstream, they arrive at the entrance of the bifurcation, and they cause a periodic, let's say, so it's not a fairly regular variation of the discharge. The other cases are actually sub-resonant if you compute the resonant condition in those cases. And the first case is a relatively weak forcing. And when the forcing is relatively weak, what happens to the system is an evolution towards one unbalanced state. This is what they call bar perturbed, because the bar actually makes the system oscillating, but one of the two channels tends to dominate. On the other side, when the forcing effect of bars is relatively strong, you can have a switching behavior, which transitions between one state and the other state. Probably they are not very regular as we have seen before, because in this case, you can also account for the fact that we can have random variation that we cannot take into account that are enough to cause switching. And in this nonlinear case, the effect on noise can be quite important. But we can explain, with the framework based on this free force concept, you can have an interpretation of what is going on in this case, but not only in this case, but also in general when you have different behaviors depending on whether you are in super resonant or in sub-resonant conditions. Well, as a final remark, and then I will conclude, we must consider that bifurcation actually are not isolated. But what happens in the surrounding of the bifurcation is usually not something really external, but it's something that depends on the evolution of the bifurcation itself. This is, for example, the case of a bifurcation in a distributory network, what we were discussing with Gerard. And also, for example, the case of a bifurcation followed by a confluence. In this case, what happens, which is what we are studying now in Trento, in this case, what happens is that downstream condition, like downstream slope, is not something externally imposed. It's something that depends on the evolution of the bifurcation itself. And in this case, the system has more degree of freedom, has the possibility of form autogenic oscillations, and eventually we are discussing again with Gerard, it can generate also chaotic behavior. So in this case, does the free force concept still make sense? I think that this is really a matter of spatial and temporal scales. In particular, I think that if you focus on single bifurcation, this concept can be still useful as far as what happens in the surrounding varies on a slower time scale compared with the time scale of the bifurcation. In other cases, the system is more coupled, so it's hard to use our interpretation to understand what's going on in that case. So as a final conclusion, just to tell you that if you are interested in deepening this topic, you can ask me, but you can also find the first part of this talk in this JF Journal of Fluid Mechanics paper. And the second part is in another paper on ESPL. So thank you for the attention. And if you have questions, I'm available.